Hi everybody, it's Laura. Thank you so much for joining me on my channel. Today I have a video that's a little bit different. I know from many of your comments on my YouTube channel that you haven't yet tried mixed media, although I know that a lot of people have expressed interest. So I was thinking that I was going to slow this video down, maybe simplify the layout a little bit, and show you what you need to do to get started with mixed media. The first thing I'm going to do is show you the materials that you could use, and then I'm going to complete a layout using those materials. So the very first thing that you're going to need is a surface to work on. And if your surface is not like mine, you definitely want to protect it. If you have a surface like this, my tabletop is glass, then you don't have to worry so much about ruining your surface. But I would definitely start out with either a surface that you can get messy on or some way of protecting it, maybe putting some paper or something else over it, maybe an old tablecloth, to make sure that you don't ruin whatever table or surface you're working on. The next thing you're going to need is a piece of paper. Now, I often like to start off with a white piece of paper. And I also think that this is the best option for someone who's just starting off with mixed media, because if you make a mistake, it's not a precious piece of pattern paper, it's just a white piece of paper. And what I do if I ever make a mistake is I will use my dies and I'll die cut out from the paper that I kind of messed up on a whole bunch of embellishments. So the paper does not go to waste, but if I happen to make something that I don't like, it's easier to replace a piece of white paper than it is a piece of pattern paper. So that's how I think that one could start. That's how I started anyway. Another thing you're going to need is some paint brushes. You will need a large brush to spread the gesso around, which I'll talk about in a minute. You could actually use a small house painting brush. You don't have to buy anything really fancy. And then you're going to need a smaller brush. So you could use anything that you have. I like to use a brush that's about this big. You could also use a round brush. This is a flat one, but I really believe in using what you have. So see what you have around the house in the way of paintbrushes. You're also going to need to make a mixed media background the way I do, a piece of plastic. Any kind of packaging can be used. I've used this several times before. It goes a long way. You're also going to need some paints. So today in this video, I'm going to be working with the Shimmerz Color Kitz collection from March. And it has 5 different colors, but I'm going to be using these 2 colors. I'm going to be using this Shimmerz. This Shimmerz is called Hello Yellow. Shimmerz paint is a little bit of a thicker paint with a lot of shimmer to it. And then I'm also going to be using this Inklings. This Inklings is called Blue Lagoon. Isn't it a beautiful shade of blue? And the Inklings are similar in that they're very shimmery, but they're a watercolor paint. So those are the 2 paints I'm going to be using. Like I said, there are a few other paints in the kit from March, but I'm not going to be using these, I don't think, on my layout. You never know. Sometimes I'll add little touches by the end, but I do think that it's important to stick to 1 or 2 paints to begin with. You don't want to get too crazy. I think that it's best even if you just want to pick one thing, and I might end up just using 1 paint. Another thing that you're going to use is you're going to have some water. I have a mug full of water. Excuse how full of paint this is, but I have this to put my paintbrushes in. But you're also going to need some water to water down your paints a little bit. I like to use a spray bottle. It doesn't have to be this kind of a spray bottle. It could just be a household spray bottle. I got these on sale, so I bought a couple of them, so I have these handy, but any kind of spray bottle would work out well. And then this is something that I really find it hard to make a layout without using something to put over the paint. You could use stamping. What I'm going to do and what I recommend that you do if you're just starting mixed media is to use a stencil. So you can use any stencil that you like. I'm going to be using this Vicki Boutin stencil. Vicki Boutin stencils are pretty inexpensive, so you can get a 3-pack. It's not that much, not going to break the bank. I also recommend using this is a palette knife, but you don't need this. You could use a credit card, or you could use a little scraper like this. Anything that you could use to spread the modeling paste. And of course, you're going to need modeling paste too. So I'm going to be using this modeling paste from the Crafters Workshop. but you could use any modeling paste that you can find. And you don't have to buy big containers. You could buy small containers to begin with. I do want to mention again that this step with the modeling paste, this is totally optional. I don't want you to become overwhelmed with all the things you have to buy. So if you just want to get the paper and the paints, that's just fine. Now, another word about the paper. This is 120 pounds smooth cardstock. I do a lot of mixed media, so I buy this in bulk. This is actually copy paper. It comes in 12 by 18 inch sheets, and I cut it down to 12 by 12. But there are a lot of papers out there that you could use. I know that Vicki Boutin makes a foundation paper that's 140 pounds paper that's even thicker than this, so I would imagine that would be a great paper to work on. You can also find things from Amazon. There's lots of different options out there, but I would look for a fairly heavyweight paper. I really like the smooth surface, although you could also use a watercolor paper, but I think that it's best to start off with the smooth. What to do next? The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my paper and I'm going to coat it with gesso. So this is clear gesso from Shimmerz paints. You could also use white gesso. I often use white Liquitex gesso, but I have this clear gesso from Shimmerz paints handy, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cover my paper with the clear gesso. Now, it doesn't really matter for this paper because it's white. If you're going to be using a pattern paper, that might be a little bit of an advanced project, but you can use clear on that. This is perfect for going over pattern papers. That way you still keep the pattern, but you still have the protection of gesso. If you're using a white paper, piece of paper like this, you could use clear gesso or you could use white gesso. It doesn't really matter. Okay, and then after you coat your paper with the gesso, you're going to allow it to air dry. So the reason for using gesso is that the gesso creates a barrier between the paint and your paper. And the main reason that I like to use it is because if you don't put down a layer of gesso, the paint will immediately get absorbed into your paper and you can't move it around. It's a personal preference. Some people don't like to use gesso. I just really find that after using it, I can't get used to not having it. So to me, it's the first step. But you could try doing it without gesso. I just feel like it's definitely best to start out that way. So the next thing that you have to do is you have to kind of figure out where the major elements on your page are going to go. You don't have to know where every little embellishment is going to be, but for mixed media, you do have to have some idea of where you're going to put things. So I'm trying to keep this a little bit simple. I have a circle here. My photo is going to go on the circle, and then I'm going to have my title down here. Now I'm going to add a lot more. This is going to add some pattern paper and some other embellishments, but this is a general idea of where I'm going to have things. So I'm going to just add some really light pencil lines, something like that. And I'm going to give myself an idea of where to put the mixed media, but you can see that I'm not making very dark lines because if I want to move anything around, the pencil lines can be pretty noticeable. So this is just going to be a little bit of a marking, just kind of indicating around where the circle is going to be, and just a little bit of pencil line showing me where the rainbow is going to be. And that's enough to let me know where I'm going to put my mixed media. I know I don't have to put anything in the center over here, and I know that I want to add some in this area, and I'm going to put my title, so the letters are probably going to span out a little bit. And it's okay if the area is a little bit bigger or smaller than your embellishments, but I do kind of like to add a lot of paint to the background more than a little bit of paint. That's a personal preference. I've seen some beautiful layouts that just have a little bit of mixed media. It's totally up to you, and if you, once again, are new to this, you'll develop your own style. So now I'm ready to start adding my paint to the background. Well, I'm going to start with this Shimmerz Hello Yellow. I'm going to use my clean paintbrush to mix it up. Now, this paint goes a long way, so I just want to put a little bit of it on my plastic. add a little bit of water to it, and then I'm going to start smushing it down against the paper. I'm going to go around this circle, and I don't want it to be too regular. I want to make sure that it looks like it's natural, and that's what I like about this technique, is because if you apply it with a paintbrush, or if I should say if I apply it with a paintbrush, it ends up looking just very symmetrical, and I feel like this looks a little bit more natural, a little bit more like the color just kind of fell on the page. Of course, you can control that a little bit, how much randomness you want. But I do like it to look a little bit more like it wasn't painted on there. Whenever I use a paintbrush, it's very difficult for me to get the look that I want. So that's why I have consistently used this technique for many years. I've used other techniques, but this is definitely my go-to and my favorite one. And like I said, it's okay if you go past a little bit, or if you have some areas that there's a little bit more or a little bit less, you just want to add a little bit of paint. So I think we can all agree that that's not hard to do, right? I'm going to do the same thing down here in this corner. Okay, like I said, I know I'm going to have that rainbow, and then I'm going to have the title down here. So I'm going to make this area maybe a little bit bigger than this little line would indicate, but it just tells me where that rainbow is going to go. I'm going to spread the color out around it. Now I kind of like the way this looks. This looks a little bit solid, so I'm going to kind of extend this out a little bit. And just remember, your first attempt, when you're making your first attempt, you might think like, wow, this doesn't look like anything. That's what I always think when I'm doing my mixed media. It just looks like a blob of paint. The magic comes, though, when you start layering things on top, because you don't want to see the whole thing. You really do just want to see little bits of it. Now, the thing that I like about using the Shimmerz paint is that it has excellent coverage. It doesn't require you to put a lot of it on there in order for you to have like a nice, deep, rich color. So this is one of the colors that, well, I'm sorry, this is one of the types of paint that I really love to use for the mixed media effect or process. Nevertheless, though, you might want to add more than one application of the color. I do find that it's nice to have the deeper, richer colors that you can get from adding more than one application. And you don't have to apply it multiple times in every place. You might have some areas where you just have, that's a little bit too thick, where you have a little bit, and some areas where it's thinner, some areas where it's thicker. And I'm spreading the paint out a little bit just so it doesn't look just like a big circle. I want it to be in a circle, but I also want there to be some variation in the circle. I don't just want to have a circle. So that's what I'm thinking. And like I said, this paint goes a long way, so I can get a lot of use out of just the paint that's still on my paintbrush. Now I'm going to use a heat tool to dry this. You definitely don't have to do that. You could just let it dry and come back later. That's not a tool that you have to invest in if you're not even really sure if you want to do a lot of mixed media. But it is something that I like to use just to speed the process along. The paper actually will buckle a little bit more if you use the heat tool. So if you have the patience, it's probably best to wait for it to dry. But since I want to get my layout done as quickly as possible, I don't have any patience for that. Once I get started, I like to move it along. So I'm going to use a heat tool. Before I do that, though, I'm just going to hold my elements over the top just to see how I'm doing. So I feel like that looks pretty good. Pretty happy with the way that that looks. And then where's my rainbow? That's going to be down here. think I might add a little bit more by the rainbow, just extend it out a little bit. Because I was thinking I might use the letters that are in the kit for my title on this layout. And they might be a little bit bigger than I'm guessing over here. So I'm going to just spread out the color a little bit more. And you can see that here I'm just repeating these same steps over and over again until I like where the color is and how dark the color is. And I just keep going until I feel like I have it looking the way I want it. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time here repeating these steps. And if you feel like you got the idea, you can just fast forward. But I wanted to include the footage because I want you to see that there's no trick to it. There's nothing special that happens. I'm just squishing paint against paper, and it's really that simple. Okay, so that's my first round of color application, and I'm going to go ahead and dry it a little bit. I don't know if you could see that, but this is super, super, super shimmery. And I think that the shimmer just adds a lot of fun to the background. I really like it a lot. So now that the background is dry, I'm going to add another application. And I know that this takes a little bit of time. You could do so many different things here though. You can allow the color to drip. You can extend it out. We're also going to add splatters in a little while. You could add other colors. There's a lot of different things you could do. Another thing that I like to sometimes do is add a little bit of paint without putting a lot of water, and then it just kind of stamps on and creates a different effect than it does when you add a lot of water. And sometimes I like to add that in. There's a lot of different things you could do, and it just takes some experimentation to see like what it is that you like when you're adding paint to the background. There's a lot of different ways to do it. There's endless options, right, of ways that you could make a background like this. So like I said before, I'm not going to add color in every single spot the second time because I want there to be a little bit of variation in color. I'm really, really big on variation. I feel like I never want to have areas that are just totally flat color. I shouldn't say never, but I don't want to have large areas usually on my backgrounds that are flat color. I love there to be darks and lights and splatters and different things to make every little inch a little bit interesting. Okay, so I have to say that we can all agree that we can all do this, right? This is just taking paint and it's squishing it in two different spots on my layout. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add some splatters. So to make some splatters, I'm going to put a little bit of paint in the cap. You don't have to put it in the cap. You could put it right on your surface. You might have a palette, but I'm going to water it down a bit because it takes the paint to be kind of watered down to be able to splatter. And you could kind of experiment, add a little bit more water until you find that it can splatter. And I'm just tapping my paintbrush in order to add the splatters. It is best to wait until your paint is a little bit dry before adding splatters, because otherwise the splatters will just combine with the paint that you already have on your page and they won't really be as noticeable. And I know earlier I said I was going to use this beautiful color. I really love this color, but I think I'm going to just stick to this one color for this layout because you really just need one color to create a mixed media background. Now, mixed media would imply that you're using more than one different type of media, meaning you're using paints, you're using inks, you're using texture paste, things like that. So we are going to be adding some texture paste in a little while. And again, you don't need to do this. This is enough. If you just start adding your elements on top of this, you're going to have a beautiful, beautiful look. But I'm just going to add just one more step just to show you what you could do. You don't have to do this on your first layout or any layout, but I do really love the look of the modeling paste. So I'm going to add that in, but we could stop right here if we wanted to. So if you've never used a stencil with modeling paste before, you want to get a decent amount, not too much, a decent amount of modeling paste on your implement, whether you're using a palette knife or you're using a scraper or something like that. You lay down the stencil and you apply the modeling paste. You're supposed to anyway. I don't always do this. I'm not gonna tell you that I do, but you're supposed to apply the modeling paste all in the same direction. I'm not going to cover the entire area with a solid image from the stencil. I want to have some areas that have the modeling paste and some areas that don't. Don't forget though, this is an added step. You definitely don't have to do this. I love these lines going in different ways. I think this is a really cool stencil. Like I said, this is a Vicky Boutin stencil. I've had this in my stash for quite a while. And I'm going through a little stage where I really like lines. I'm using a number of stencils with lines recently. And I don't want to have a very straight edge when I use the modeling paste. I want it to be a little jagged. You don't want to have just a straight line of modeling paste going across. This stencil actually works really well for that because it's really tricky to do something like that with this stencil. But if you have a stencil that doesn't have lines going in lots of different directions, you might find that when you add the modeling paste, you have a straight line along the edge. Whoops. And you can just fix that by going in with your, whatever you're using, your palette knife or your scraper, and you can just pick up a little bit of it. And you don't want a ton of modeling paste. I just scrape it until the modeling paste is even with the surface of the stencil. You don't want to have it spilling all over the place, or you don't want to have it piled high on top of the stencil. You just want a little bit of it. A little bit goes a long way. Okay, so there we go. I'm going to go ahead and let that dry for a little while, and I'm going to clean off my stencil. It's important to clean this off as soon as you can. And don't forget to put the lid back on your modeling paste so that it doesn't dry out. There's one other touch that I want to add, and that is some black splatters. The collection, the March collection, has a lot of black elements in it, and so I want to make sure that the background ties in with those elements. But again, this is not something you have to do on your first layout. I just wanted to show it to you as an option. I have this pre-mixed because I add a lot of black and white splatters to my page. So this is black acrylic paint with water mixed into it. And then I find that although I don't use it as a spray bottle, I do use this little straw. It's probably not called a straw, but I do use that in my splattering because the splatters are going to come off of the paint that's on this little straw. And I'm using my scissors to tap against the top, and then that way the splatters will be small. I don't want big, huge black splatters. I just want a couple of them. And I can't stress enough that it's not necessary to do all of these things on one layout. All you have to do is use a little bit of paint, and that will start you off with a beautiful first mixed media background. But if you are ambitious and you want to try this out, you can definitely do it. I often will use white splatters. However, like I said, I want to tie this in with the collection, so I'm using some black splatters, but you really can't go wrong with white splatters. On this background, you wouldn't see them very well. There's other backgrounds where you could see them a little bit more, but you definitely, in my opinion, you can't really go wrong with white splatters. They just add a little bit of character to the layout. Black you have to be a little bit more careful with because it is such a fantastic dominant color, and so I went a little bit easy on the black splatters, but I do think that this will help to make the layout look the best in the end because there'll be a little bit of black to tie in with the black that's in the pattern papers and the other embellishments. So now I'm going to allow this to totally dry before I continue with my layout.
So the rest of the video is going to be some sped up footage that I'm voicing over. I'm going to be making a small mat for my mixed media background, which means that I'm going to cut the mixed media background just a little bit, just so you'll be able to see the mat on all four sides. I often use this technique where I use some strips of paper and I put them around the edge of a piece of paper in order to make a mat. This is my favorite type of pattern paper to do this with. It's a striped paper. And if I was to gut this paper, the stripes would just be running one way. But because I'm using these strips of paper, I really like the effect where you can see all of the colors on each of the strips and therefore each side of the paper. I hope that that makes sense. So I cut out 4 strips of paper that measures approximately 1 inch. 2 of the strips are solid, and then I cut 45-degree angles in 2 of the strips. I put the solid strips down first, and then I layer the strips that I cut the 45-degree angles out of on top of the solid strips. And then I'm going to attach my mixed media background down. So I wanted to put a solid right behind the mixed media background. I decided to go with a really, really thin mat of black because, as I mentioned, there are quite a few black accents in this collection. So I thought that this would be a good place to bring a little touch of black in. I'm also using some black to mat this large circle that I'm going to be using in the upper left-hand corner. Before I attach the pattern paper circle with all the hearts on it down to the slightly larger black mat, I ink the edges with a little bit of Distress Oxide in Victorian Velvet, and then I add some adhesive and I put it right in that spot where I had planned to put it when I added the mixed media. And now I'm matting my photo. It's already matted on some white cardstock, and then I'm going to mat it again on some pink cardstock, and once again on a thin black mat, just to kind of tie everything together. And before I attach my photo down, I use my phone to take a picture of the date because that's something that I don't want to forget. And I have often forgot to write down, and I'm peeling the picture back or trying to find the picture on my phone, but this picture is definitely too old to be found on my phone, so I wanted to make sure that I remembered the date. I think it's crazy how many things that we use our phone cameras for. I don't know what we used to do before them. I added a little bit of white cardstock to reinforce the rainbow ephemera piece. Now, it's not because the paper isn't a good weight. It's because I want to reinforce it because it's resting against the mixed media background and there's modeling paste, which can be bumpy. And I don't want the ephemera paste to take on the bumps that are on the background. So I find that adding a little bit of cardstock prevents that from happening. And my title is Sweet. I use the letters from the Color Kitz collection, and I fan those across the rainbow. So I always feel like it's great to use whatever you have in your stash. If you're thinking of starting out with mixed media and you want to have a kit that includes everything you would need with everything coordinated, the Color Kitz collections are great for that. You get all of the pattern papers, you get the embellishments, and you also get the paints, and everything is coordinated. So that's one way that you can approach starting with mixed media. But you can use, like I said, anything that you have in your stash just to give it a try. So I arranged some ephemera and one of the dots that comes in the kit around my photo in 2 different clusters. And the next day I was looking at the layout and I thought that I love the colors of the title, but because everything else on my layout has a black border, I felt like the title needed to have a black border as well. So I attach each of the letters down to some black cardstock, and then I cut around each of the letters, and I keep the way I cut out the black mat very simple. I don't cut into too many little crevices. I just kind of cut along the straight lines. So I reattach all those letters down, and I definitely think that that was necessary for this particular layout just because I've added that black border in so many areas on the layout. And then the layout didn't seem like it was quite done. So I was thinking that I wanted to add some strips of paper behind the photo and continuing off onto the right-hand side of the layout. So I used some of the same paper that I used in the background. I cut that into strips, but the strips weren't quite long enough. So I cut some strips of white paper, and then I attached the strips of pattern paper down to the white strips, leaving a little blank area where I know the photo is going to cover the strip up. And I guess you could probably just try to piece this together, but I know myself, and I've tried doing stuff like that in the past without adding this step of adding the white paper behind it, and the results weren't great. So I've learned that this really helps me to not have to worry about keeping everything straight. And this is what works for me, but it's, like I said, kind of an extra step that you could choose not to do. So I wanted to add some fishtails, so I used my scissors and I cut some fishtails in the right-hand side of each of the strips. I'm only going to cut it on that side. And then I was thinking that I wanted to ink the edges, so I used a couple of Distress Oxides. I used the Cracked Pistachio for the green paper. I used Fossilized Amber for the yellow paper, and then I'm going to use some Victorian Velvet for the pink paper. And then once I had all of the strips inked, I slipped them behind the photo. And even with adding those white strips of paper, it still took me a little bit of maneuvering to get those strips where I wanted them and to get them straight on the page. I did slightly overlap them. I thought that that would help them to look a little bit more cohesive. So earlier I was talking about the surface you work on for a mixed media layout, and I am in love with my glass table. It was very inexpensive. I got it at IKEA. I find that the glass tabletops are great for cleaning up the mixed media, but I think they're great for cleaning up pretty much any craft project, but you definitely don't need to have a glass tabletop. I've often used the packaging paper from Amazon boxes or other shipping boxes to protect a surface that I'm working on. If you're interested in working on a glass mat, you can use something like what I have under my layout right now. It's just a small glass mat. I know that Tim Holtz makes a glass mat too. You can use a garbage bag. You could take a look in your recycling bin and see if there's anything in there that you could use and just throw it away later. I recommend to just try it out and get started. I really hope that you'll consider it. So I reconstructed that little cluster to the right-hand side of the photo. And then I also added a couple of stars, also from the ephemera pack, to the right of the circle. And then I really like those right away, so I figured I'll just go ahead and attach them down. And then I often like to add a dot to the end of strips of paper that I've made into a fishtail. So I use some enamel dots that I had in my stash, and I added those. I'm using some glossy accents to hold them in place. I didn't really like the way the smaller dot that I was trying to use looked, so I moved that over to the record. And then I also wanted to add a little something between each of the letters in the title. So I'm using some little jewels that I also had in my stash. I love adding jewels. That's the way I love to finish off a layout, jewels or any kind of dots or pearls. So I have a couple of those in my stash. And now I'm using a few more of those same clear jewels in the background. Not too many, just adding a couple around the circle just to add a little bit of sparkle to the background. And the glossy accents is great for holding jewels and pearls and dots in place, especially on a mixed media background that has modeling paste. since it's a little bit harder for the adhesive to stick to modeling paste than it is for it to stick to regular paper. And then I was almost done with the layout, and then I was thinking, this little cloud looks really nice to the right of the photo. So that was the last little touch, and the layout is complete. So I hope that if you haven't before, that you'll give making a mixed media background a try. My hope is that this video makes it fairly clear that it's really not that hard to do and it's worth trying out. Check out the latest Shimmerz Paints Color Kits collection by going to the Shimmerz shop, and you could see this month's kit. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I hope to see you again soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.